diary, why your diary doesn't lie. For anyone who has listened to the podcast this week, it's very rare that we have a podcast title that starts with a why. Why can be, it's a bit blunt. It's a bit of a blunt instrument sometimes. And our brains often respond to whys in a bit of fight or flight mechanism, because it's quite confrontational. Why questions are quite confrontational. There is that great TED talk by Tasha Eurich on why we should use what questions instead of why, particularly when we're coaching each other. So we were obviously having a moment of feeling a bit sort of bolder and blunter when we were like, right, why your diary doesn't lie. So hopefully we were like, it's okay. Our listeners will all be up for being honest and transparent about their diaries. So first question for all of you. Looking at your next week, and mine is a bit of a cheat because I'd obviously recorded the podcast and I've sorted some stuff since. So mine actually now for next week is not what it was before the podcast. Look at next week and let me know in chat. Describe your week based on your diary. So looking at your diary, like what does your week feel like, look like? What are the words that spring to mind? Let's see where we all are with our diaries. Carnage from Jen there. A tale of two halves. Nice, Rachel. Overwhelming. Planned, Alistair. Okay, that might be good, might not be good. I guess if you feel it's over planned, you might be like, oh, there's no freedom. Or you might be going, no, I feel very organized and in control. Messy and chaotic. Totally different. Oh, Sam's on holiday, so it doesn't count. Joe, a roller coaster. Spinning plates. Busy but manageable. Okay, Claire, you're like, there's always a lot going on. I think that's the reality for all of us. Lucy saying ambitious. I guess ambitious can go either way. Sometimes I think when things are ambitious, it only takes having had a week like this, like a spanner in the works, then things fall apart very quickly if you've been very ambitious. Like a color-coded calendar. Oh, very nice. Do you know what? I've started to realize why people might color code their calendar. It's not something I do loads of. You can see a bit on the screen of mine. Varied, a learning week, lovely. Structured, lots of project meetings, maybe too many meetings already. Full but some breathing space. Okay, interesting. It's just a good way to start. So kind of looking ahead, I actually tried to do it for a month and I actually found that too zoomed out, but that might work better for you. So kind of play around with this about kind of looking ahead and going, well, what is my diary telling me? Is my diary telling me that I'm overcommitted? Is my diary telling me actually I've done a good job of getting some kind of space? I'm doing the right things. Lots of people saying they're big into color coding. I think partly I just need to figure out how to do that in a way that works. But yeah, just start by thinking sort of what does my diary tell me today? Then I'd love to know how in control of your own diary do you feel? If you can use annotations, if you could put a star on the screen. So do you feel sort of less than 40% in control, sort of 40 to 60, the blue, 60% plus or 80% plus? I was thinking this morning, I was like, does that make sense? When you're sort of in that slight woolly phase of your brain might not be firing on all cylinders. Broadly, hopefully that makes sense. I got myself all caught up in percentages. But basically, how in control of your calendar are you? Because I have been in some jobs where that level of control has been very low. And I was actually a bit worried about that with this podcast. I wanted to make sure that we weren't talking about things that then didn't feel realistic for people to do. But so far, I think 60%, lots of people in that 60% plus bracket. If you've not used the stars before, view options, annotate, stamp, and then star. If you can't use the annotation, don't stress, just answer the questions for yourself. A few of you in 40%, and we've got at least one star that I can see in sort of the less than 40%. I have definitely been in jobs where I felt way more like that, where it felt like the majority of my day was out of my control. It was sort of other people were putting meetings into my diary. It felt like there was very little that I could shift. So if you are in that sort of lower end, definitely not alone, but good to see there's a fair few 80% plus, which is amazing, and quite a lot of 60% plus. So maybe not all of it, but the majority, right? The majority rather than the minority. Okay, let me just get those stars away. Okay. So thinking about your next week, we're going to do a bit of live working out together this morning. If you were going to make a change to your calendar, what would you want it to be? I'm going to give you 4 options. So I'm going to do a bit of a forcing function and say one of these 4. If you were going to change one of these 4, which would it be? And then I'm going to give you freedom to say, and now it can be anything because one of these 4 might not be the right thing for you. So the first change is the balance in your week between thinking, so spending time thinking, or doing. So if you were thinking about thinking, if you were looking ahead to your next week, if you're in that, that mode of I spend all of my time doing, it's actions, it's tasks, it's moving things forward, but very little time actually thinking about things, sort of zooming out. Now, we did the podcast on thinking versus doing. And I think the mistake sometimes is always feeling like thinking has to be allocated separately from doing. I think if we always assign thinking as a separate task, we're sometimes missing the point. But equally, if we don't have any space or any time to think, that's often something I hear from people. I have no time to think. That might be something that kind of rings true for you, and there might be a change or some changes you want to make. Yeah, more fixed meetings, Laura, interestingly. And you're in an agile way of working. Yeah, that is interesting. I do find that interesting. Hardly used to-do lists, everything. That's interesting, Claudia. Everything goes in your diary to make sure you block time for it. Yeah, that's kind of a smart way to approach things. Yeah, Zoe, your manager's got a standing meeting called Time to Think. That's quite a smart thing, especially if you're recognizing I don't have enough time to think, or I want to sort of create a change. So maybe it's a thinking, doing change. Maybe it's more about people. So whether that is spending time having curious career conversations, or just spending time with people outside of your day-to-day. So that point that we often make, that we spend a lot of our time, sometimes all of our time, building relationships around our day job, but not building relationships beyond the ones that we need right now. And we know for our career resilience, for our learning, for pulling possibilities our way, we need to spend some time with people, having those curious conversations, those more explorative conversations. They could be still around your job, but perhaps it's with an adjacent team. Just somebody that you don't come into contact with as frequently. If you're always spending time with the same people every week, you are probably limiting your learning. So perhaps there's sort of a people change that you're like, oh yeah, actually, I'd like to make a change around like who I'm spending time with. Not to say people you're spending time with right now are not the right people, but kind of mixing it up a bit, increasing your range. Maybe there is something about, I'm going to attempt to draw a jigsaw piece here, work-life fit. So this idea of bringing together all the different things that are important to you. So maybe you think of this as boundaries. Maybe when you look at your week, depending on how you manage it, it feels like you really think about work, but then you don't really think about yourself or doing some of those things like active rest. So something that really engages your brain, but in a very different way to work, or just resting, or just doing something for yourself, like during the work day. It's very old school, isn't it? The idea of a sort of lunch break. But I think the idea of giving our brain a break is really important. So I don't want to be told, as somebody who loves variety, you must have a lunch break at a certain time, but I do want a break. And so thinking about this is not just about what happens after work, but also what happens in the work day, so that your kind of brain is firing on all cylinders. If you remember a few weeks ago in the meetings podcast, we referenced those images of brains. And it's a Microsoft report, which I'm sure we can find for you. It's definitely in the meeting notes from that podcast, where it showed, it kind of color-coded your brain based on whether you have a break in the day and between meetings or whether you don't. And honestly, like the neurons in your brain work so much better and so much harder for you when you have these sort of micro brain breaks. So it could be about that, could be a bigger thing about work-life fit. I don't know, you're not doing any exercise and you want to be cooking and you're not getting the time to do that. So maybe there's a change about work-life fit. And then finally, maybe there's a change you want to make that's more about your growth and your learning. So when you look ahead to your week, you think, well, there's no There's no time to be curious for myself. There's no time for my sort of personal development. There's no sort of learning time in there. And again, learning is not always separate to your day job. Of course, most of our learning happens in our day job, but sometimes you might kind of go, well, actually, when I look ahead to any week, I can't ever see anything that I would categorize in my calendar as sort of learning for me. My question would be, what do you want to learn this year? So what's your learning goal or goals for this year? How can I see those learning goals showing up in your diary? I ask that question quite a lot of workshops. What's your learning goal for this year? I'd say at least 50% of people can't answer that question. We just don't, people just don't know. Probably because they've just not thought about it. They've just not asked themselves that question. So know the answer to that question. And then does your diary reflect that that's something that you want to learn? So again, stars on the screen. Is there a change there you would like to make? Is it about people, work-life fit, thinking, doing, learning, or is there something different? Let me know in chat. Is there something different? Yeah, PodPlus is a good example actually of what we're going to talk about next, which is sort of a ritual and a rhythm. Happens at the same time every week. You perhaps just get used to coming. If it's something you do by default now, that's perhaps a good thing, because you just think, oh, well, I just come now. I've just got used to it. Whatever the topic, I just think, well, I'll turn up and hopefully learn something. And I've created that space in a week. Oh, it's become a must-do meeting. Brilliant. Don't like to think of it as a meeting, but that's okay. As long as it's a useful meeting, that's all right. It's a treat. I like that. It's a treat. A treat for us all for learning. Helen and I were saying it always gives us an energy boost. We talk about doing an energy audit. PodPlus is always like a high energy moment. I'll take that, Sam. One of the most useful meetings in the week. Oh yeah, I suppose we've not been around for the last couple of weeks because it's been Easter. And then you think, oh, a Monday morning. We are thinking about that. We are thinking about, do we do something different for those weeks? Helen's desperately trying to convince me we should be doing lots of video, and I'm being sort of dragged, slightly kicking and screaming. But we will be doing some videos, I'm sure. She's very persuasive. And it's a habit. Yeah, okay. Is there anything different? Yeah, Laura, we won't stop doing it live, more for just those weeks where we can't do it. Is there anything when you look for next week and you think, well, if I was going to make just one change to my calendar, it would be, is it less meetings? So yeah, Laura's saying less meetings. Focus on ways of working meetings, that you actively participate. Yeah. So actually, I didn't put less meetings on there, but I bet that might be one for some of you. Less back-to-back meetings. Yeah, Katie, the curse of the back-to-back meeting. Oh no, you're going to the dentist clinic. That really makes me laugh. Keeping the boundary. Less work for others. That's interesting, Zoe. That would be a good contrast. How much am I working on my own priorities? We're going to talk about priorities next. How often am I working on other people's priorities? That'd be a really good question. Yeah, Will, I'm not a fan of a last minute meeting. It's funny, I love variety, but I'm also quite structured in my thinking. Helen's brilliant. I think they're sort of structured and spontaneous. And I think there is a lot to be said sometimes for spontaneously. Can we fix this fast? Can we do this now? Very much Helen's way of working. Whereas I will sort of very much look for space in the future versus do something now. Yeah, Lucy saying breathing space between meetings. Moving things to make big blocks of free time. I think, Ellie, that is a really good observation. Our brains don't love switching. We've said this before, but the more you switch in a day, the more our brains it takes us time to sort of leave behind where we were and to catch up with where we're going. And that takes a lot of energy. And it's actually a hard thing for our brains to do. So much better to be dedicated, the whole one thing at once. So we know multitasking doesn't work. We're all tempted by it, but it doesn't work. So definitely do one thing at once. And if you can block together similar sorts of work, much, much better for our brains. We'll just do better quality of work. So that idea of sort of the same work at the same time would also be a smart thing to do. Schedule time for actions. I actually read a really good post this week on LinkedIn by David Hyatt. If you don't follow David Hyatt on LinkedIn, he's a really good writer and he's a really smart guy. He's been on the podcast before, and he's the creator of something called Do Lectures and the Do Books, which I'm sure lots of you have heard of. But he's also built some brands. So he's done really interesting things. I've actually been on a tour around the jean factory that he runs down in Wales. So he runs a jeans company as well as doing things like Do Lectures and Do Books. And what David said this week on LinkedIn, he actually talked about this idea of scheduling time for what we would call, I think we did talk about this in the podcast, rapid response. So David's observation was, I have become a bottleneck. So I've become a bottleneck in my own organisation. And Helen and I sometimes talk about that. Like, we often feel like we're a bit of a bottleneck. And so actually sometimes then big blocks of time just feel like you're creating even more of a bottleneck. And actually David talked about this idea of going, right, I'm going to have a couple of moments in the week that are sort of ritual moments of rhythm where I will respond to what my team need from me. And then the rest of the time, just give everybody lots more space and autonomy, and trying to sort of do something in your diary to kind of, I suppose, unlock that bottleneck. It's he's worth following anyway, but Lucy has done a brilliant job there very quickly of finding that article. Thank you so much, Lucy. Just being super, super useful for us this morning. Worth a read if you recognise you're like, I do need some time to kind of quickly go back to people, or I'm in a job that requires that. I've been in jobs where I couldn't block out time that often because people needed you. It's quite a reactive role. So if you're in a reactive role, definitely worth a read. A checkout at the end of the week. Yeah, that's really nice, especially because you were saying you finish on a Thursday. So you kind of go, right, does anyone need anything? That makes a lot of sense. I like that idea. So when you've got your one change, think about, how is this going to work? So are you going to attach it to something you already do? So we know habit stacking works. So is there something you already do that you could attach that change to? So like, I already have this meeting every week. I'm going to attach thinking time for 15 minutes after it. Like Lucy was saying earlier, I want some more breathing space. So, okay, when particularly do I want that breathing space? Is it after a client meeting? Okay, after every client meeting, do I have a 15 minutes breathing space where I just go, right, reflect on what I heard, make sure I've got decent notes before I move on to the next thing. So is it about habit stacking, attaching? Is it about adding in that change to something that already happens? So rather than adding on, you're sort of adding in. So you might have a change where you go, actually, I want to make some time in meetings to get feedback, or we want to sort of slightly restructure how we do something in a project meeting. Is it that more about changing what you already do? Or do you need an accountability partner? All of these three things we know just help to increase your chances of success. Is it just about telling someone that you're going to do something, because actually that increases our likelihood of actually doing it? Or is it about actually doing that thing alongside someone? I actually nearly wrote alongside as well, but then I was getting too carried away with A's. But I know that Helen finds it really helpful if she's got to do time blocking to be doing that alongside me, whereas I don't need that because I'm so happy time blocking, but she finds it much harder because she's more of a rapid response person. What I do find useful is actually just sharing that I'm going to do something by a certain point. So if I say to Helen, I'm going to do it by this time, then it helps me to sort of stay accountable. So if I was making a change, like I was saying, I'm going to really commit to going to this exercise class every week, actually just telling Helen would really help me. So that would be an accountability partner kind of communication there. Or maybe it's about rhythms and rituals. So one of the things that Lucy and our team was sharing yesterday is that she's on a learning program at the moment where the learning happens at the same time every week. So the actual program happens at the same time, and then the catch-ups that she has with other people on the program also happen at the same time. A bit like PodPlus, I guess, same thing. We just get really used to it. It sort of then happens. So rather than us feeling like we've got to do something different, which is always hard, if you've got a rhythm or ritual, much more likely that that change will stick. When I reflected here on this bit is less of a problem for me than what's coming up next, which is the priorities one. I recognized that some of the rhythms and rituals that I'd previously had just disappeared. So I needed to sort of reprioritize those, re-put them back in my diary again. So for whatever reason, they just kind of fallen by the wayside, like these things often do. So for me, it was just about getting those rhythms and rituals sort of back in my diary. So now let's talk priorities. So that first bit was more about you being proactive and what your diary tells you really about how you spend your time. Your diary is also very revealing about your priorities. So firstly, you've got to know your priorities. So hopefully you do. But then thinking about your priorities if a fly on the wall was looking at your diary, what would a fly tell me about your priorities? And what would you tell me about your priorities? And how much overlap versus gaps have we got? So to think of this visually, if these were my 3 priorities, I'm just going to do them as shapes for today. I often think in shapes, bizarrely. So if these are my 3 priorities, when I look at my diary for next week, over the next month, I might go, well, actually, brilliant. Priority number 1 shows up really consistently in my diary. I can see how I'm going to make progress. It's very clear that it's a really important priority for me. Next one, I might say, there is some evidence of number 2 being a priority, but probably not enough. So it's present, but it's way lower down than perhaps other things that I can see I'm spending time on. So that might make me question, have I got the balance right in terms of where I'm spending my time, what I'm spending my time on? So it's not completely disappeared. There is some evidence, but nowhere near as much as perhaps there should be. And then maybe number 3, and this is sort of a true reflection for me, actually isn't there at all. And what it makes you question, do you really understand what that priority is? So when I went through this process, this is exactly what I found. 1 was very clear cut. I was 100% clear on the priority, and it was 100% present in the way that I thought it should be, just about making some tweaks. Number 1. Number 2, I was like, not really. Given how ambitious that priority is, there's no way we're going to make as much progress as we want to doing what we're doing today. So that made me think, okay, I do need to do something differently. And then the 3rd one just made me realize I didn't understand what one of our priorities was. And actually, this is where having a conversation with your manager can be quite useful. Helen and I actually realized through this podcast, Helen's actually got a very clear view of this priority here, and I haven't. But that's not very helpful when it's something that we work on together, because we have sort of shared priorities. So this is quite confronting, I found. I was like, oh, okay, not always that easy. That first one, maybe you can make sort of smaller tweaks and changes. It's one change. This one, I think, takes a bit of rewiring, because I can't make all of these things happen overnight. I need to think a little bit differently about, okay, so, well, what's missing? And also probably some trade-offs. I think here you're getting into time trade-offs, because I can't just find more time. Turning that into a circle is not just going to be, oh, it's fine, because I've got so much space in my diary. I'll just add in loads of time for that. So it's going to have to be taking things away. It's going to have to be either delegating, something waiting, or stopping. And so you've got to make some choices. So here, I think you're in choices and trade-off territory. And here you're in, well, certainly for me, asking some questions territory, like needing a conversation before I can then figure out actually what that would even mean in terms of how I'm spending my time. So just maybe have a go at this for you. You wouldn't necessarily have to do 3 priorities. You might just do 1. And looking over just 1 week might not be enough. It depends on your work, I think. But I found some of the priorities, you do have to look further ahead than a week. A week might be too zoomed in. You might need to zoom out just a bit more over a month. And it's not only have you got the time, have you got the right kind of time? Because actually that was my reflection for this first one. I had got time, but I hadn't got the right kind of time to do what I needed to do for that first one. So that's a sort of the change that I've needed to make there. So there are lots of things, and it really prompted me to reflect on actions that I now need to take. All right, I'm just going to clear those there. Final idea for you, tool for teams. So thinking about how might you do this as a team, or how might you do this together? How might you take this idea and have a conversation about it? Of course, you might talk to your manager about going, there's a mismatch between my priorities and how I'm spending my time. We would always advocate involve, don't solve when it comes to these things. What ideas have you got, but what ideas have they got too? I also wondered about the idea of borrowing from zero-based budgeting. Now, if any of you have done zero-based budgeting, it might sort of bring you out in a slightly cold sweat, because I have done this. So zero-based budgeting was very popular, probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. And the idea was, rather than, budgets are often, we had £1 million to spend last year. Oh, so we'll have £1 million to spend this year, or maybe a bit more. It's starting from scratch every time. So you have to sort of submit your budgets starting from zero, from an assumption of like, I've got to re-justify everything. So there's sort of, people have a love-hate relationship, I would say, with zero-based budgeting. However, we're not doing budgeting. We're actually thinking about sort of zero-based diary time, more as a way just to start from scratch. So if your diary was empty, so this is my empty diary here. If your diary was empty, how would you fill it as a team? And I think this could be a really interesting exercise then to kind of go, rather than everything always being incremental, or we sometimes describe it as like Frankensteining, like a little change here or a little change here, but you're sort of starting from where you already are. This is starting with nothing, because then you might go, well, actually, what I would do, I would make my Monday meetings all the same sorts of meetings, and actually I'd make them 15 minutes, for example. So maybe actually Monday becomes your team doing day, but they're short, sharp, specific meetings. Maybe you then always have some space here for something you want to do personally. Maybe you'd always have something here, which is, and maybe here, who knows, very short brain breaks, where you're like, okay, brain break, brain break. Now, realistically, we probably can't completely start from scratch, but I do wonder what this would tell you. I think you would get some data, some insights around how you might want to work differently together as a team. If you sort of start from a blank piece of paper, you might realize you've got too many meetings. You might realize you've got too many people in meetings, that perhaps you can divide things up. Oh, well, Lucy can go to that meeting and I'll go to that one. We probably don't both need to be in that one. And so it's less about going, you're then necessarily going to implement what you would get to, but I think it probably would end up prompting you to think, well, what can we get rid of? What can we change? Where are we maybe wasting time? What are we not doing well? If everybody is in back-to-back meetings the whole time, we know we can't be as effective as we need to be. So that, I just think it could be quite a fun activity. You've probably got to have quite a high trust team to do this. Somebody talking about getting things done. I am interviewing David on Monday about getting things done. So that is an Ask the Expert episode that is coming soon. Yeah, a bit of a blast from the past, isn't he? So I hope that has felt helpful. I personally have found this actually a really useful, useful for me personally, like particularly on that priorities one. Partly going back and just thinking, am I setting myself up for success generally in terms of how I'm working? But also, we talk about prioritizing. I'm never sure the old important urgent matrix works, or it doesn't work that well for me, because everything always feels important and urgent. This has actually been more helpful for me on prioritizing than anything I've done previously, because it has really challenged me to think about my time, how I spend it, and kind of what that looks like. Is it the right kind of time? So thank you everybody for joining. See you next week. I do feel a lot better, partly having spent time with all of you. I'm now going to go and see if I can eat something. Haven't eaten for quite a long time. So that's going to be my task for the next half an hour. Thank you so much, everyone. See you all again soon. Bye.